afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to come to talk today. So I'm going to talk about investigating moisture because that's one of the things that leads to mould. I'm going to focus on moisture and its investigation. Originally, I was an architect. I now investigate building defects. I've done a bit of training in drying and a bit of mould, but generally I look at the moisture side of things, and my colleagues can go further into the actual mould and what type of mould it is, and that sort of thing. Today I'm going to look at what the sources of moisture are, have a look at some of the standards, how I go about investigating moisture, and then look at some case studies. So sources of moisture, like habitation, people living somewhere creates moisture in itself. People breathing, washing, cooking, all these activities create moisture. So if you imagine a property was empty, there wouldn't be as much moisture in it as if there were people living in there. So then we start looking at kind of overcrowding, because that will create more moisture than a property that isn't overcrowded. So the moisture that comes from habitation, that will be in the atmosphere, in the property. This can lead to kind of condensation. So in this example, we've got some mould at the top of the staircase. This is a little bit of roof where it's not insulated properly. And what's happened here is warm moisture-laden air in the property has touched a colder surface. It's kind of condensed. If the moisture stays around for a while, mould can then form. There's a second type of condensation that can occur, which is more difficult to diagnose. This is interstitial condensation, a bit of a word. Essentially what it means is condensation that occurs that isn't visible, and it occurs within the building itself, within the building envelope, and can only really be investigated by opening up bits of walls and roof to find this condensation. And what happens is, as moisture is generated inside the property, it will try and move outwards, it will try and move through walls, move through the roof, and as it moves through, it will cool down. And if it can't escape and isn't ventilated, it will then condense on a layer somewhere within the building envelope, so within the roof or the walls, and this can then create damp and mould within the building itself, and it's difficult to diagnose and difficult to get rid of. The only real way to investigate interstitial condensation and look at it in more detail is to do calculations about how the building envelope is performing in different times of the year, because the conditions internally and externally will change, and this can affect its likelihood of condensation. There's a British standard to do with moisture, BS 5250, and it started introducing some of these concepts about humidity and mould and moisture. If there were two rooms, one at 60% and one at 40% relative humidity, just by using those figures, it isn't possible to tell which is damper, because relative humidity only relates to how much moisture the air can hold at the temperature it's at. So if you heat a room up, hot air can hold more moisture, so it needs to be looked at in combination. I've just drawn this diagram to try and explain the kind of the phenomenon of condensation and how this then leads to mould. So, warm air inside a property, and the walls are colder. What will happen as the air touches the wall? The air will cool down, and if the wall's significantly cold, the air, as it cools, the humidity of that air will go up. If it goes up high enough to 100% relative humidity, so it can't hold any more moisture, you then get to the point known as the dew point, where there's condensation, and that's why we get this moisture on the surface of the wall. If that moisture stays around, it doesn't dry off, we then have condensate, we then have mould. It's gone through a couple of these concepts. This is from the British Standard. Just touch on the mould growth. Mould doesn't actually need doesn't actually need liquid moisture on the wall to grow. Certain mould, certain early kind of colonisers, they can start growing when the wall's at 70% or 80% humidity. So you may not see moisture, but it's still at risk of the mould growth. Have a look at some of the causes of mould. So moving on, this is a property where there was a penetrating damp issue. There was a roof leak. Water came in through the roof, went into this apartment. The way to tell this is a penetrating damp issue and not a condensation issue is this is on the internal wall, whereas on the external wall, the window, there is no mould there. There's a possibility this could have been an escape of water, so that was investigated as well. But this was a penetrating damp issue. Some of the other issues that can cause damp and mould, like escape of water. In this situation, there was heating pipes that were laid into the floor and then cast in the floor, so very difficult to investigate. They had to dig up the floor to find where the leaks were. This is someone's kitchen where the floor has collapsed. Timber floors, they need to be ventilated, like underneath. If they're not adequately ventilated, then the air within this subfloor void, humidity will go up, and timber will absorb moisture from the air. And basically what's happened here, the subfloor isn't ventilated, the timber has absorbed moisture over a long period of time, and it's just rotted away and eventually collapsed. Rising damp. This isn't that frequent. This situation, I think it was rising damp. It had been previously diagnosed as rising damp. There'd be rising damp treatment in this property. It occurs at the base of walls, going up sometimes 2 meters. It damages finishes. And one important thing about rising damp, it's not associated with a mould, because the salts, what happens is the water comes from the ground, goes up through the wall, and that water's contaminated with ground salt, nitrates and chlorides, and they basically stop mould growing. So generally, if there's a rising damp issue, it may not necessarily be mould, or if it's mould, it's not necessarily kind of rising damp. There's some separate issues that to be looked at. This one was a tricky one. This is actually on the first floor property, and it's an old chimney. And the property owner, I think it was a tenanted property, he just couldn't work out why his chimney was still damp. He'd done a lot of work to his house to try and investigate what was happening. He'd demolished the chimney, rebuilt the roof, I think replastered it, and yet I've altered the contrast in this, so you can see the damp patches, but there was still damp in this wall. And what this is it's salt contamination from the chimney, from coal or wood being burnt for many years. That wood, it will deposit salts up in the brickwork, soak through the chimney, and then what happens is, depending on the moisture in the property itself, if it's a damp day, the walls will absorb moisture from the room and look damp, and other days they may dry out, and there's no way to really sort this out because actually it's in the brickwork. The best thing to do is to try and cover it up, put membranes over it, and that's the only way to really treat it. But this one, his tenant kept complaining, he didn't know what the problem was, and you do all sorts of things to it and you couldn't sort it up. So looking at the causes, Is it a building defect that's related that's caused the damp? Is that to do with design or construction? Or is it something linked to the maintenance of the property? There's also the sort of human factors, occupation, how people are using it, how they're occupying, how many people there are, that sort of thing, that will lead potentially to issues. Some of the standards, building regulations. I'm only going to go through this very briefly, I'm not going into the detail of building regs, but building regulations only apply to properties at the time in which they're built. So if we're looking at a building defect, I need to look at the building regulations that were current at the time when it was constructed, not when the issues happened. So I always try and go back and look at what was there at the time. There's a building regulation about moisture, and actually a lot of the detail in the regulation actually relates to the causes of damp that I was talking about. So there's regulations about essentially rising damp, stopping rain, which is penetrating damp, condensation, and then escapes of water, making sure they're not going to cause a lot of problems. Ventilation. It's important that property is adequately ventilated. One of the reasons is to reduce the amount of moisture in the air, which leads back to condensation. Then making sure the heating system works properly and the building's adequately insulated, because this will all lead back to whether or not the occupier, they can actually heat their house properly, whether the house is losing too much heat, whether you get condensation in areas that are cold. The Housing Act, so this is looking at some properties as they are, like a standard and a rating system associated with it. I'm going to touch on the guidance rather than the legal side of it. We'll look at some of one of the categories to do with the housing rating scheme is mould and growth, damp and mould growth. And there's sort of health effects to do with that. It talks about breathing difficulties, depression, anxiety, fungal infection. Increased moisture can cause like kind of dust mites, and we also need to look at what happens when you renovate a property. If it's more sealed up, it's been insulated, what's the knock-on effect of that? And then looking at some of the ways which we can prevent damp and moisture. So making sure bath appliances are fitted correctly, pipes are correctly insulated so you don't freeze and leak, maintenance to gutters, correctly installed, someone's looking at them, making sure they're full up. Because I mean, this type of issue, overflowing gutters can cause a lot of trouble with water penetrating damp, soaking the tops of walls, rock roofs. And this was a case I investigated. This was a base of a wall where water was getting in behind the sort of a damp-proof membrane at the base. And essentially, it was a timber structure building, and it rotted quite a bit of the structure of the building. Poor seals around windows, get damp staining. This was an example of this situation where we're getting interstitial condensation. This is a roof void, and we can see at the bottom of the slide there's some insulation. And effectively what's happening is air goes up through the roof, passes through the insulation, and then there's this space above that's cold. In that space the air will condense, and over time fungus will grow and it will rot the roof structure. Make sure there aren't any gaps in the insulation, because if the rest of the wall is well insulated, you've got one spot that's colder, that's where condensation happens, that's where mould will grow. make sure the ventilation's working. So the kitchen extract, room extract, and also that the tenants, the occupiers, know how to use these systems. Are they maintained? Because sometimes you ask, do you use your extract system? Oh, it makes a lot of noise, you don't know how to use it, and you go into the flat and you realise that it's all been switched off at the consumer unit, because actually it's not functional for the users. Adequately heated. I mean, this property I went to, I think it was in March, it was about 10 degrees outside, and it was heated to 27 degrees C. So there wasn't any mould in there, but that amount of heat means it's going to hold a lot of moisture in the air, and if there's any problems, you're going to get condensation, because of the fact that you're going to hold so much moisture. And there's other legislation and guidance to do with damper mould. I'm not going to go into some detail. One thing I'm going to touch on is that PCA guidance, and they set out sort of standards for in investigation of damper mould, and that's quite a useful kind of benchmark for how a damp survey should be carried out. Looking at how I go about investigating damper mould issues, and actually one of the most important things I think is talk to the people in the property about what's happening. So where's the problem? How often? What weather does it happen in? Does it happen in summer and winter? Does the wind blow in a certain direction? If it's water coming in, is it a teaspoonful? Is it a bucketful? I can get a lot of information just by people walking around and telling me what's going on. It's important that I understand what the issue is. Review of documents, if there are previous reports, maintenance information, drawings of the property, that's very useful. And then just using my senses to look, feel and smell. Immediately you walk into property and you can tell if it's damp, you can smell, I would say. And what do the surfaces feel like? Do the walls feel wet to the touch? Is there visible mould? This can build up a picture straight away. And then if I'm looking at like damp and timber decay, I use metal spike quite a lot. So I don't need a damp meter to tell me if something's like decayed or not. Just go around, prod, see if things are solid. Really useful bit of kit. And looking at those damp meters, this is a standard pin damp meter. Pin bit that will basically tell resistance. These things are calibrated to timber, so they're very useful for using in timber. They'll tell you if the timber is at risk of decay or not. They're more nuanced with other building materials, and they'll more tell you relative, so how something is more damper than something else, the relative. So it's good to take a series of readings and compare. I wouldn't want to just stick it and say, yeah, take a photograph. Not because I see a photograph with damp meter, oh, that's 50%, that's damp, that wall. It doesn't really tell you what's going on. And then the back of it is another type of damp meter where I can scan the wall and it will give me relative readings of 0 to 100 or 0 to 1,000 of how damp the wall is, just to get an idea of. Yeah. This device is very similar to the back of this device for early stage moisture mapping. Which bit of the wall is damper than which other bit? I can do on the floor and the ceiling. And it's good to get an early picture of what's going on. This is a hygrometer, very important for investigating condensation of mould, because this measures relative humidity and temperature. And what it will also do, it will measure, it's got an infrared temperature probe, so I can measure the temperature of the wall. I can then compare it with the dew point of the wall, and it will tell me if the wall is at risk of condensation. So if someone hasn't got one of these, you can't really investigate condensation of mould. These things aren't going to tell me the answer. The thing about this is it only tells me what's going on at the time when I do the survey. That evening it could be different, next day it's only a snapshot. So what we can do is data logging. leave some devices in the property and outside, and then come back after a month and look at the readings. A different type of hygrometer is one of these, a floor hygrometer. This is for looking at whether concrete floors are damp. What I do is stick it to the floor and just leave it for 24 hours, and there's a little pocket of air in this, which over 24 hours, any moisture in the floor will basically seep up and equalise with this space, and you can then measure it. Using one of these devices to try and work out if the floor is damp or not, it will only tell you the top 20 mil of the floor. This might be dry, but later on, more moisture will come up through the floor, and it won't actually be dry. But this is the sort of British standard way of telling if the floor is damp or not. I've also got devices for looking at whether timber floors are damp, so you can actually hammer this into the floor, because the top of the floor might be dry, but actually what we're interested in, that situation with the kitchen and the floor collapsed, is to try and look at what's going on underneath and in the thickness of the timber, so you can hammer this through the timber and measure. This device, you can slip it underneath that skirting board. It's quite often damp occurs at the junction between floors and walls, so this will tell you what's going on at that point. And these bits of kit are for doing salt analysis. You can take off a little bit of bits of wallpaper from the wall, test it with these chemicals. It will tell you if there's chlorides and nitrate contamination. It won't absolutely diagnose rising damp, but it helps to build a picture of what's happening, and it's a very quick test that can be done on site. And then what we've also got is thermal imaging cameras. I've got one with me. And what a thermal imaging camera does, essentially every pixel is a thermometer, and it's just basically building up like hundreds of thermometers all together, telling you what the surface temperature that is. So it can be used if the wall's cold, then it can tell me if there's a likelihood of condensation and damp. A couple of case studies. This was a basement flat. There's on the floor, there's been kind of salt coming through the floor, called effervescent salt, which is where water's basically passed through the materials and start to bring sort of residue to the surface. And up on the left-hand side, there is some water staining. They're actually two separate issues. This flat the basement flat, it had been waterproofed about 30 years ago. They only done half the property. They only done, I think, this part after that arch, and they'd done the wall up to about 1 metre. What was really difficult to work out was he was only just reporting damp, but the waterproofing had been the same situation for 30 years. Either he hadn't noticed it getting damp, or something had changed. This sort of moisture, this salt's going through the floor. Outside, this was out the front, floor up. The drive sloped down towards the front door, and there were cracks in it. We think that water was basically penetrating through these cracks, and because the basement wasn't waterproofed, it was just seeping in. And then in the light well at the front, there was a drainage channel. Actually, this had only just been installed recently. We did some surveys on it. Actually, there were some kind of cracks in it that was leaking out, and there was a pipe that went underneath the floor to escape the water from that. It's actually causing a problem. Another property, tried to show where there's some sort of damp staining on the wall above a window. This was on the top floor. Up on the roof, it had like a kind of mansard roof with a box gutter, and in areas it felt a bit squidgy, but actually the floor itself, the waterproofing, was all, it had been tested and it was all fine. Later on we went back and it had been stripped out and it all rotted. All the deck had rotted, and I think there was plywood up the side of the wall as well, and that had all completely rotted all the way around. And this was actually condensation that had come up from the floor below, condensed under the membranes, couldn't get out, and then rotted the roof, and then started dripping back down again, water inside the property. This is a house where there'd been flooding about 10 years ago, and they'd done remedial work. They replaced bits of the floor, and now other bits of the floor had started to sink. This is actually dry rot, white staining. And outside, I think it was a relative of the insured who decided to stop the flooding. He basically moved, so there's an air brick down at low level. We've got to move it up higher, blocked up the bottom one. But by moving it up, there actually wasn't a proper flow of air through there because it clashed with bits of the floor. So he stopped the ventilation, therefore it rotted. Out the back, they've gone and installed decking all the way along the back of the property, which basically stopped all the ventilation that had all been. There's a secondary issue about whether it actually been dried properly. There was sort of two causes of the problem. All right, thank you very much. Yeah, hi.
Right, so I'm going to be talking this afternoon about housing-related diseases on two screens and causation issues. So I'm going to go through the most common illnesses and diseases people develop that lead to these types of claims. I thought it was worth first just looking at, when you're looking at housing disrepair claim, think what is housing disrepair? So that's when the condition of a rented house or flat, either through social housing or a private landlord, has deteriorated or changed negatively in comparison to the state of the dwelling at the time that the person moved in. So this can be damage, deterioration to the exterior, can be to the interior, the structure, or the common parts when the house is divided into flats. There's normally a lease involved, and whoever's responsible, the lease outlines who is responsible to maintain the place, and so failure to do so can lead to a housing disrepair claim. As you know from what Sam's been saying now and from the claims you deal with, I'm sure we're not just talking about physical deterioration. Mould, clearly, as we've seen, is a big problem. Infestation, gutter issues, anything really that prevents someone from being able to live normally and safely in their home. So if someone has suffered injury or illness as a result of those issues, that's where housing disrepair claim comes. So looking at causation, before I go on to the different illnesses and diseases, I thought I'd just briefly summarise the legal position on causation. And so what the claimant needs to do is establish the connection between the defendant's wrong and the claimant's damage. So firstly, was that wrong? In this case, whether it's the mould, the damp, whatever it is, is that capable of causing the claimant harm, illness, injury? And then is there sufficient evidence to show the link between the damage and the illness or injury? One of the tests is looking at is there a material contribution from the wrong to the damage? So that contribution doesn't have to be the only cause of the illness or injury. It doesn't have to be the main cause, but it has to be a cause and contribute to that illness or injury. And what the courts will look at is whether it's the operative or effective cause of the loss. We look at the but-for test, probably well be aware of, would the damage which the claimant sustained have occurred but for the negligence or the wrongdoing of the defendant? And it's an exclusionary test where we look at excluding other factors and again looking at the operative cause. So there's a whole host of illnesses and injuries can be caused by poor housing conditions. I'm going to go through some of the most common ones. You can see that's the list. Respiratory illnesses is probably the most common when we're dealing with damp and mould and issues like that. People do develop skin complaints, neurological complaints, and other issues too. So with respiratory illnesses, asthma, I would say, is the most common illness you get in these types of claims. It's a chronic lung disease, affects people of all ages, and it's caused by inflammation and muscle tightening around the airways, and that makes it hard to breathe. Symptoms: coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, chest tightness. Asthma has a very wide range of severity. Some people get it very mildly, some people get it very, very badly, some people have it over a very short period, and some people over very long periods. So there's a whole range, and you'll see this in the claims. Some claims will be of very low value for asthma, but some will be quite significant. When you're looking at causes, mould is a cause of asthma, so is dust. There's lots of different causes. So if you're dealing with a claim for asthma in a housing related issue, you would have to look at what is the real cause. Is it from the poor housing condition? Is it from something else? To say, there's a whole list. You can see these are just some of them here. And there's also a list of different factors associated with the development of asthma that you have to take into account. So for younger people, if they have a low birth weight or premature birth. For older people, do they smoke? Are they overweight? And for everyone, it can be a hereditary cause also. So these are things you should consider when looking at someone with asthma. Are any of these factors relevant? Are there any other possible causes? And what is the effective cause of the illness? So this is another respiratory condition, hypersensitivity pneumonitis. It's an immune system disorder. It causes the lungs to become inflamed. And that is in reaction to things like bacteria, fungi, or other chemicals. So breathing in mold and fungi is one of the main causes, as is dust. But there's lots of other causes too. Animal fur, chemicals, bird droppings. Come across one case recently with someone working in an area surrounded by where pigeons gathered, and it was covered in pigeon droppings, and he developed this condition from that. So there are a range of causes. Allergic rhinitis, or more commonly known as hay fever, also can be caused by mold. Variety of different symptoms, but again, there's a whole range of different causes. You can be well aware it can come from pollen, it can come from pets, it can come from cockroaches, various different things. And then I've got respiratory infections as kind of catch-all. Again, exposure to mold is a cause of respiratory infections. Things like bronchitis, pneumonia. And again, I've set out the range of different causes. One I like here is regular contact with children. Yeah. If you want to avoid a respiratory infection, I'd steer clear if I were you. This is a good one to pronounce. Allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis. So this is a condition that reacts to a certain type of mold, and it typically affects patients with an underlying predisposition, which can be asthma or cystic fibrosis. So it is something from mold. So if a claim was made, you may think straight away that, well, it's likely to have come from mold in someone's home, but again, there's other types, or there's other places where that mold could have come from, such as soil, compost, rotting leaves, plants, trees, crops. So it's important to look at what was this person doing, what do they do in their work, what's their medical history, what do they do in their spare time, because a range of different causes, even with a condition like this, which is related to mold specifically. I put in asbestos-related diseases. I'm not going to dwell on this. That's a whole topic in itself, or several topics in itself probably. But obviously, older social housing, buildings in general have asbestos that gets disturbed, and we know the kinds of problems that can lead to. So that's it for respiratory conditions. Skin conditions can develop from living in poor housing. Mold rash is one that we would deal with here. It's an allergic skin condition caused by mold exposure. And it's common in people who are sensitive or allergic to mold. One of the problems in terms of causation is that it can be hard to identify because it doesn't have any unique features. It's similar to other types of skin conditions, and that means causation is not always clear cut. The sort of more generic terms of these skin conditions is dermatitis or eczema. There's two main types of dermatitis: contact dermatitis and atopic. So contact is when you come into contact with something that you react to. Atopic is slightly different. It's normally someone who is susceptible and breathe something in or be exposed to some kind of substance. That can be mold, that can be damp, it can be dust. So it can develop in people living in very unsuitable housing. Again, range of different symptoms that are all pretty unpleasant. Rashes, dry, scaly skin, swelling, oozing and weeping. The list goes on. It's often quite a mild condition, but again, it can be more serious. It can be chronic, and so claims you get with these types of injury are not always low value claims. They can be a bit more significant. And then the more serious or slightly more severe skin conditions, hives and urticaria. Those are a bit more serious, but not particularly common. But again, can be caused and can lead to claims in this area. Living for a long time in poor conditions can lead to neurological symptoms. Again, it's not as common as respiratory symptoms or skin conditions, but it does happen. This is often through the release of chemicals called mycotoxins. And they can trigger an immune response in the body that affects the nervous system. And mycotoxins are toxic substances that are produced by certain types of mold. So when the mold grows inside buildings, it releases these mycotoxins into the air. People inhale them. They can harm the brain directly, and they can affect brain function. And they do that by interfering with the nervous system's pathways. Again, it can lead to a range of symptoms: headaches, seizures, brain fog, and anxiety, depression, and mood change. Another one here is pain syndromes. Again, not the most common, and causation is often far from clear-cut in these situations, but fibromyalgia is one, complex regional pain syndrome is another. They're both fairly complex conditions. They often have psychological components. Fibromyalgia in particular is very non-specific, can affect different parts of the body. And I'm not sure if living in poor conditions alone can cause fibromyalgia or complex regional pain syndrome, but it can be a factor. It can be a contributing factor. And I've just listed some other illnesses and injuries, psychiatric injuries, Siobhan's going to talk about in a minute. Poisoning, toxic exposure, gastrointestinal diseases, can get more serious illnesses, strokes, heart attacks, and that kind of thing. And then just general physical injuries, which is plain old accidents. When looking at causation, it's also good to look at who is most sensitive to the conditions, who is susceptible, and it's really very young people, very old people, and people with pre-existing problems. People with a weakened immune system is another one. Now, we take out victim as we find them, and it doesn't affect the claim too much, but it's still important to be aware of these things. So the range of illnesses people can develop is wide. I just wanted to talk about one extreme case, which you're probably aware of, the case of Awal Kishak. Tragic case where a young boy died from exposure to black mold in his property in Rochdale. It was run by a housing association who let the property fall into this condition. Awal's father complained, they didn't do anything about it, they told him to paint over the mold, and he ended up dying as a result of living there. That was due to prolonged exposure to black mold in his home. And I just wanted to show that the range of illnesses, injuries, and more that can happen, from the very mild to the quite extreme. This did lead to a change in the law, Awab's law, which is coming into place this October. There's now stricter duties on landlords and better rights for tenants to demand repairs. It's a phased implementation. It's coming in soon. It's initially starting off with damp and mould only, but that will extend as the years develop. But what that means is it might, well, it should be easier for people to claim, possibly, and maybe we'll see more of these claims as a result. But we'll have to see on that. And that's it. Thank you.